Hello, economics students. Hey, today we're going to start getting into true macroeconomics. I know that when you signed up for this class, you signed up for a macroeconomics college level class, but up to now, we've really been dealing with concepts that are equally applicable to both macroeconomics and microeconomics. But now that we've gotten through our supply and demand unit, we're really going to be focusing for the rest of the semester on true macroeconomics. And I start off this presentation with this photograph of a large city. Wondered if you can tell where this city is. It is one of the great centers of international commerce and the international economy. The clue to what this city is would be in the background here, that mountain. And you see it's got a flat top, which means it's most likely a volcano. And indeed it is, because that is Mount Fuji and this is Tokyo. And I just kind of like that picture. And Tokyo is a major player in the economy of the world. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into true macroeconomics. Now, first of all, I'm going to ask a question. How do economists assess the health of a society's economy? And there's really three areas that we look at in macroeconomics. The first of which is gross domestic product. We'll be dealing with gross domestic product in detail in a week or two or three. But for now, just suffice it to say that the gross domestic product, or GDP, as we oftentimes call it, is really the total value of a nation's economy in a year. And you can see how the gross domestic product has developed in the United States. Going back, I began this graph in 1958. And you can see how the economy has grown in the United States in that period of time. You see those little bars in there, these shaded bars. Those represent recessions when the economy actually dipped a little bit. And you can see our last recession right here was in the spring of 2020, which was quite a deep recession actually, and that's of course from COVID, but it was a very short-lived recession, and we pulled out of that rather quickly. Another area that the economists like to look at is the purchasing power parity of the GDP. This is important. For example, Iceland, if you look at their GDP per person, Iceland is really just about as wealthy as the United States is per person. However, things are much, much more expensive in Iceland. Housing is much more expensive, clothing is more expensive, food is more expensive, everything is more expensive in Iceland. So even though their per person GDP is roughly equivalent to ours, we actually live a little bit better than people in Iceland, because we want to have purchasing power parity. We want to see what the GDP is for these countries, assuming that a house that's 30,000 square or 3,000 square feet in Iceland would be the same as a house at 3,000 square feet in the United States. We want to see how that ranks. How much does a pound of beef cost in Iceland versus the United States? And then we get to the purchasing power parity to judge the economic output and power of a country. We also look at the unemployment rate, and again, I have the unemployment rate here of the United States beginning in 1958, I believe, or actually it goes even to 1948. And you can see the ups and downs. When the line is high, that's high unemployment, so we want the line to be low. And typically our unemployment corresponds to these recessionary periods in the shaded area on the graph. And again, look how high unemployment got during the COVID recession, but fortunately it was also short-lived, and the employment is now back to where it was prior to COVID, actually a little bit better even. And finally, we look at inflation, and here again we have an inflation graph, and a high peak means high inflation. And we have had some pretty significant inflation as I'm recording this video in the fall of 2022. But as you can see from this graph, we have had higher inflation in our history. So let's hope that our current inflationary cycle is going to flatten out, and I think it probably will. And let's hope it doesn't get as high as it was, say, back around 1980 in the late 70s. In that period, it was really quite high. So those are the three areas that we like to look at when we're judging a society's economy. And of course, the question then is, why do we do this in the first place? Does it make our lives any better if we know that we have high unemployment? Well, of course, it does matter that we measure this, because this helps us to put together policies that we can use to address high inflation or to address high unemployment. So we need to know what the situation is in the economy in order to have proper policies put out by our government and other organizations that can address any weaknesses that the economy is experiencing. And that gets us to something else. I want to talk a little bit about the miracle of modern economic growth. And take a look at this. If you go way back in time, like hundreds of years, even 1,000 years or more, for the longest time, people lived about the same. You know, most people were living on small farms, and frankly, someone who lived in the year 8300 didn't live remarkably different than someone who lived in the year 1700. People's lives were pretty much the same from an economic standpoint, you know, from the standpoint of the quality of their uh, material lives. It really just didn't change much for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But then look what happens beginning it really starts happening in the UK in the late 1700s. But from a global perspective, it really doesn't start to change noticeably until the mid 1800s. But then look what happens. And what you have here are two lines. It's just two different ways to measure economic output. And look how it just starts to explode as we get into the late 1800s and into the 1900s. We're living so much better from an economic material standpoint today than ever before in the history of mankind. And it's been just a phenomenal growth in economic output. We call that the miracle of modern economic growth. And it is a miracle. And you might be wondering, well, what happened in the 1800s that caused this to take place? And it really goes back to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was such an amazing historical occurrence. There's never been anything like it, and we are still living the consequences of that today. It has not only made us materially more wealthy, but physically better off as well. You know, we're much more healthy now than we were as a people 200 years ago, 300 years ago, much, much more healthy. And that Industrial Revolution made that possible. So that's the miracle of modern economic growth. Now, that economic growth hasn't been equal across all areas of the world. And the first area to really experience this miracle of economic growth would be Western Europe and the United States. And that's what you see here in this graph. Other areas of the world experienced this miracle of economic growth much, much later than the United States and Western Europe did. That really accounts for the reason other parts of the world lag Western Europe and the United States in wealth, in gross domestic product. China has boomed economically during the last 20 or 30 years, but still the China lags the United States in GDP per capita. Why? Because they didn't start that miracle of economic growth until really 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So that is really the explanation of why there are relatively poor areas in the world compared to the rich areas of the world. It's when this miracle of modern economic growth took place. And as Western Europe and North America began to get wealthier and wealthier while the rest of the world stayed behind, we call that event the Great Divergence. The Great Divergence is when all of a sudden Western Europe and the United States become much, much wealthier than the rest of the world. It's really incredible because for much of world history, China and India were actually much, much better off from a wealth perspective than Western Europe was. But that did all change with the miracle of modern economic growth and the Great Divergence. Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about something else we look at from a macroeconomic perspective, and that's savings and investment. And these two items are also very, very important in economic growth. So, a couple of definitions. Savings is simply the difference between income and spending. If I make $50,000 a year and I spend $40,000 a year, by definition, then I have saved $10,000 that year. Difference between income and spending. Investment, definition, spending on the production of new capital goods. And I put this little note here. This is not the same definition of investment that you may be familiar with. Probably when you think about investment, you probably think about buying stock or buying real estate, some kind of financial investment to try to make your money grow. But from an economic standpoint, economic investment is spending on the production of new capital goods. And just to make sure that we remember what capital goods are all the manufactured goods that are used in the production of consumer goods and services. Capital goods are one of those productive resources that we talked about in the first week of school, the factors of production. So economic investment is spending on the production of new capital goods as opposed to financial investment, which is investment or the purchase of stocks and bonds and real estate, those kinds of financial instruments. So when we do save, going back to savings, what happens to our savings? Well, savings will be deposited, and they'll be deposited into typically banks or some kind of insurance fund or mutual fund, which is really a pool of different things like stocks and bonds or other financial instruments. That's what we do when we save. We don't put the money in underneath our mattress. We put the money into some kind of institutional fund of some sort. In return, those institutions give consumers interest and dividends. We talked a little bit about stock dividends already. That's going to be a reason that we put money into a bank or into stock. We get interest or dividends. We make our money grow. That's what savings is all about. And then the money that we put into savings as consumers will be loaned out to businesses, and businesses then will take that money and invest it in capital goods. So an important equation to remember is that our savings equals investment. Savings equals investment. Now, let's talk about a little paradox here. Consumer spending drives the economy. You may remember we talked about the circular flow early in the semester, and we want to get money into that circular flow to buy goods and services, and that makes our economy grow. But consumer savings fuels investment and future economic growth. And it really is a paradox. If we spend all the money that we're making, the economy will grow, but it will grow slowly. And on this production possibilities curve, if we're spending all the money that we make on consumption goods, that is consumer goods, we'll grow, but we won't grow as quickly as if we spend the money on capital goods. That is it will grow bigger if we can save our money, if we have savings, and then that savings will be used by businesses to purchase capital, and then you have quicker economic growth. That's the savings and spending paradox. And with that, we're going to stop this presentation, check Canvas, and see if there's any assignments.